Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy Szafron. This is Kitco News. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for the latest. Now, on the show today, we're tackling a significant development from Canada where the federal government has blocked the sale of critical rare earth minerals from Vital Metals to a Chinese company. Now, this action reflects Canada's strategic aim to secure crucial resources that are vital for a range of technologies from renewable energy to, of course, defense systems. But is it too late and has enough been done? These are some of the questions we're going to ask today. And similar efforts are underway in the United States, where the Biden administration is actively enhancing its critical mineral supply chain. This includes initiatives aimed at reducing dependence on foreign sources and boosting domestic production capabilities, reflecting a shared concern over the security and the sustainability of these vital resources. And joining us to discuss these implications of Canada's decision is Heather Exner-Pirot. I hope I said that right. Director of Energy, Natural Resources, and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Hey, Heather, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate your time, and I kind of want to get into this right off the top. I mean, I mentioned it in the intro. Canada recently blocked the sale of certain metals to China, citing security reasons. And talk to me about this canceled deal, Heather, if you could, and explain what specific threats this decision aims to address here.
Yeah, so this came down a few years ago. We've all been concerned about reducing dependence on Chinese rare earths processing. Rare earths are a particular set of elements. So rare earths are all critical minerals. Not all critical minerals are rare earths. But China has had a particular monopoly on this and has used its monopoly as leverage in the past with export controls. These things are used in our smartphones and defense systems and jet engines, all those things. So very important, even though it's a small market. So everyone was very anxious to diversify away from Chinese control of rare earths. Trying to capitalize on that, an Australian company started mining rare earths in Northwest Territories, about 150 kilometers from Yellowknife, and was doing that. Then the Chinese, in my opinion, had a very explicit manipulation of the market strategy to undermine Western miners. Made the rare earth commodity unviable. Vital Metals is about to go bankrupt. Came in, with a sweetheart deal to buy a share and a cash injection, which the company couldn't turn down. Now that's obviously faced some pressure, I think, from American allies internally to say, what are we still doing, selling our critical, our rare earth minerals to China? And so now the country has gotten around finally to blocking the deal.
Interesting. Okay. So Canada's went and blocked the deal, but we all know what it's been like for junior miners. Accessing capital has been extremely difficult. Talk to me a little bit more before we get into the China side about how Canada is planning to boost its own processing of these critical minerals to reduce its reliance here. I mean, is that even possible at this point?
Yeah, I mean, we're very far behind. I would say, we're at least 10 years, probably 20 years behind China on doing this. They've been very strategic. We know how much investment they put into the sector about 10 years ago. So to your point, though, and for your viewers, here's the crux of the problem is China is a dominant investor, is a dominant processor in so many of these critical minerals, not least maybe in particular rare earths. And so there's so many sticks the government can apply to stop Canadian junior miners from getting involved with the Chinese. But who else is left? If they don't have that Chinese buyer, if they don't have, that part of the supply chain, who else are they supposed to go to? And so some of us have been articulating that we need to have more of a carrot strategy rather than a stick strategy, not just punish Canadian companies for selling or get involved. And it's not illegal to sell to the Chinese, and all of our economies would collapse if it was. We're still very integrated. And so in this case, I think they did the right thing, which was not just to punish Vital Metals, which is an Australian company, for selling its Canadian rare earth stockpile, but to provide the better deal. To offer to buy it instead of the Chinese. We don't have the capability now in Canada to process those rare earths. They'll probably sit in that stockpile for at least a few years, but at least, they'll be sitting and waiting for us when we do get that processing capability.
Interesting. I was talking to a couple of leaders of lithium companies yesterday in Canada, just trying to understand even the lithium market when it comes to China. And obviously they talk a little bit about manipulation here. But one of the things I found interesting is that they said that the South Koreans have come into Canada and are actively working without, the risk that China poses here. So is this just a China problem?
For me, it's mostly a China problem, yes. And part of it is just the dominance the Chinese have been able to capture in the critical minerals market, in particular in battery metals. And that's not a coincidence. Obviously, a key plank of their economic development, their economic growth is in EVs, is in lithium-ion batteries, the supply that they built in that. And so we have seen this in lithium, we've seen it in rare earths, we've seen it in cobalt, we've seen it in nickel in Indonesia, if people are watching. This isn't a one-off, it's obviously very deliberate. You almost can't, of course China is doing this. Why wouldn't China do this? It advances their interests. They have control. Why wouldn't they try to maintain it? But from our side, from the West side, we can't just sit idly by and watch this. What's interesting with Japan, Korea, because they are energy and resource poor nations, they have thought of this more strategically for longer. They're right next door to China. They know the threats that it poses. So they've both had some critical mineral reserves, more industrial policy around this for much longer, before North America and Europe have begun thinking about it. And so, yes, I think, as a Western alliance, kind of IEA countries, OECD countries, we should be talking to each other about how we can maintain our protection on the critical mineral side, as we did with oil versus OPEC.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about that manipulation in the Chinese market. Let's bust this open a little bit. Explain to the viewers what's taking place. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stimulus in this country, or in that country of China. Is that what's really driving the market here? They're just undercutting prices, and that's creating a squeeze for this, I mean, we can't call it a better mineral, but we know that at least, some of the regulations up in Canada and the United States are a lot better than they are out east.
Yeah, so I would say, because they are so dominant in different ways in those EV battery metals, they do have the ability to manipulate it. And so rare earths, what you see is they can flood the market with product, or they can, buy and sell in a way to make it favorable for their long-term interests. And so in this case, they've really been, and you see, we all talk about critical minerals. We know we need more lithium and nickel, but the bottom has fallen out of the prices of those commodities. And based on pure free market, it's hard for a small miner to sustain those low prices for many years, or can't move ahead. And so absolutely, I think we've seen the Chinese using their dominance, using their ability to flood the market, using their ability with oversupply to put it in, to manipulate its prices and keep free market, new Western producers on the sidelines. And in nickel, a lot of us are thinking about nickel. That's a very big component. The way they've supplied and invested in Indonesia to go from a relatively minor nickel player to absolutely dominant majority producer in the world, in a way that other nickel mines in the Western world have had to be shut in, cannot expand, are not making money. Again, all of this is strategic. It's not, it's not a conspiracy theory. The Canadian Minister of Energy and Natural Resources has acknowledged it. We see the Americans actively trying to defend against it. So it's definitely happening, and hopefully we can just be smarter than the Chinese and beat them at their own game.
Yeah, it seems like the timing's a little off here, too. Okay, talk to me. You just referenced the minister. What steps is Canada taking to ensure a secure and independent supply chain here? Break down a little bit as to what's taking place now politically and with the regulations.
Yeah, so I will say probably about 5 years ago is when United States, Canada, Australia, European countries started to talk about critical minerals, and develop some strategies. And I think the COVID supply chain woes and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine exacerbated that, where this became top of mind, a priority on the security file. And so Canada, about 2 years ago, put out its own critical mineral strategy. It has advanced a few memorandum of agreements, bilateral agreements with European, Asian, American partners. Australia has done the same. Obviously, they're a big producer too. So we're all moving rhetorically and politically towards this. But at the market level, your viewers should know, obviously, that the money still isn't pouring in, that the rhetoric is not at all matching the investment coming into the market and the prices of many of these commodities. Now we're starting, obviously, gold, copper to see some movement, but not fast enough and not high enough to get more Western mines built. And so the United States has probably been the most proactive, as you might expect. Under their Defense Production Act, they can invest in allied mines. They put out their first investments in Canada last month, some small investments in lithium and I think It was a graphite mine, can't remember the second one. And they've put in, through the US Import-Export Bank, actually hundreds of billions of dollars into more advanced projects in Australia. So we are starting to see some movement. I feel like maybe we aren't falling behind anymore, but it's still going to take a lot to catch up.
Okay, so we're not falling behind, but when did we get so complacent on the Canadian side of things? When did this start to become a problem, and has it been rectified quickly enough?
I'm a student of commodity cycles, I guess, and we're both from Saskatchewan, so we saw how commodity cycles affected our province, and the volatility that when this started was, China had a one-child policy in the 1970s and 80s. And because of that, they had an enormous economic boom in the early 2000s. And that drove that commodity cycle, this 8 to 10% year over year Chinese growth, and an almost unlimited amount of investment that the Chinese were putting into minerals and markets. And that created a peak and a boom and then a bust. And so those are the seeds that I think have been planted, was that bust in 2014, where, we had been overinvested. There was too much money in the sector. People were losing money. And now it's been 10 years of basically being in the death valley, where more investment has not been forthcoming. Investors have not been making money. It hasn't been a good bet. But now we see, we can see that we will not have enough critical minerals. I often say this, CapEx peaked in 2013 in the mineral sector globally. That's not a Canadian phenomenon, that's a global phenomenon. And we've added 1 billion people since then. And so I always say, I don't think we're going to have 6 times more metals for the energy transition. I'm worried we won't have 1 times more metals. At some point, as grades are declining, we are racking up the card on investments that were made 10 years ago.
Yeah, and of course we need those mining companies to go out there and produce too. So let's talk a little bit about that and bring them in. I mean, obviously here at Kitco, we talk to a lot of different mining companies, and it's been a struggle for a couple of years. I mean, access to capital has been lacking greatly. Investment appetite has been kind of a lack thereof. It seems like it's starting to flip, but I'm curious, with the stricter regulations on Chinese investments, how are the junior mining companies coping here in this market right now?
And this is again where we can be wary, and we are, I think, of the Chinese. But what are we doing on the other side to make it easier for Western miners, for Canadian miners, to have those investments? One would be, some financial support. There's, the critical mineral strategy is worth, on paper, $3.8 billion. That's a lot of money you can move, exploration tax credits. But then you do things like the capital gains tax, which is a huge problem for the junior mining sector. The regulatory environment is not improved. We just have today, actually, the new Impact Assessment Act amendments going through. Does nothing, if you're a mining company, does nothing to say, oh, things will be better, things will be faster. Those amendments do not improve the investment scenario. So we're still looking at, the average time in Canada from discovery to production is 18 years. Is this a time with capital costs and interest rates where people want to put money on the sidelines for that long? And so there are so many other levers we could be pulling if we thought this was urgent and a priority, not just to block Chinese investment, but to make it easier and more profitable and more timely to get Canadian production out the door. I have to say one more thing. I know I'm rambling on. Mining Association of Canada just put it last month. Since 2012, Canadian production of graphite, of nickel, of cobalt, I think, have all down between 30 and 40%. Those are essential critical minerals. Copper is down 9%. Rare earths and lithium are barely on the radar in terms of Canadian production. So despite all the things we are saying, despite what we know, we are again declines in this critical mineral production instead of growing it to serve our allies who don't have the deposits at all.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it seems like, as you mentioned a few years back, everyone kind of went to the other side, just like the market does, and says, okay, we need to do this transition without really understanding the accountability of what's going to get us there. I'm curious here, what lessons can Canada draw from the U.S. and other countries that have faced similar challenges with securing their mineral supplies? What can we do here?
Yeah, I think the Americans are at least being a bit more proactive. Washington is seized. They'll talk about China and the competition for China every day, and that's a very good instigation for them to act fast. And so they are, I think we're just 2 years behind them in what we say and what we do. So in terms of having a critical mineral strategy, in terms of talking about permitting reform, in terms of investing into some of these mines. But I had to say, there's still problems in the United States too. I do a lot focus on Arctic critical minerals. They had the big copper mine, Pebble in Alaska, one of probably maybe the premier copper deposit that has not been, not a project yet in the world, and because it did conflict, frankly, it did with salmon, the EPA rejected it. And so here we know what's happening in the copper markets. We know that we can have electrification without much more copper. And we still have incredible deposits in North America that we are putting off limits for environmental reasons. And this trade-off between the local environmental impacts and then the big, capital C climate change impacts that we're going to have if we don't have electrification.
Yeah, well said, Heather, especially going into an election year in many countries. A lot of this seems like a political issue as well. People just saying whatever narrative their voters want them to hear at this point.
Yeah, well, and this is, I'm starting to say this, and I think this is true, that we need to have adult conversations about this. We can't just say that everything's easy and that there are no trade-offs involved. If we need to mine, we need to have a regulatory system laws for that. If we need to smelter and refine and process, then we need to have carbon policies that allow people to invest in those heavy emitting sectors. It is not a climate policy to allow offshoring of all our dirty sectors to China and allow ourselves to be dependent on China and to allow ourselves to transition to energy systems that depend on Chinese critical minerals, processing, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries in electric vehicles. And so I think people are aware of the problem, but there still is not, moving this glacier will still take some time in terms of really addressing it. I have to say, buying that $3 million stockpile is a very small thing to do, but is absolutely the right thing to do. And at least there's someone in Ottawa paying attention.
Yeah, we'll leave it at there. Well said. Heather Exner-Pirot, Director of Energy, Natural Resources, and the Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, joining us today from Alberta. Hey, thanks again for coming on and taking the time today, Heather. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We'll see you soon. And I'm Jeremy Szafron. For all of us here at Kitco News, thank you for tuning in. Hit that notification button for the latest, and we'll see you next time.